The dusty wind carried whispers through the streets of Silver Creek, New Mexico territory. Stories rolled through town like tumbleweeds, picking up exaggeration with every turn. They spoke of a man who lived where the settled world ended and the wild began. A man whose name made proper ladies tighten their shawls and merchants count their coins twice. Thomas Walker was what people called a half-breed, though few were brave enough to say it where he could hear. His mother had been Apache, a proud woman from the mountains who died when Tom was barely 15. His father was a Mexican vaquero, a cattle driver who got himself killed in a bar fight before Tom could even walk. At 35 winters old, Tom stood alone between worlds, belonging fully to neither. Tom owned a wide, unforgiving ranch tucked into the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The land stretched for miles in every direction, beautiful and brutal in equal measure. His property sat a hard day's ride from the nearest neighbor and 2 full days from Silver Creek itself. Folks in town talked endlessly about that ranch. Some said Tom ran cattle the Apache way, reading the land like holy scripture. Others whispered he hid gold in caves on his property, payment from desperate travelers who needed safe passage through dangerous country. But what kept tongues wagging most was his spectacular failure at marriage. 3 mail-order brides in 3 years, Mrs. Henderson announced loudly in the general store one Tuesday morning, and not one of them stayed more than a single week. Can you imagine the shame? The first bride was Charlotte from Pennsylvania. Delicate and soft-spoken, she arrived with 3 trunks of fine dresses and a head full of romantic notions about the Wild West. She cried the moment she saw the endless scrubland stretching before her and spent 4 miserable days hiding in the cabin, refusing to eat, before begging to be taken back to town. The second was Margaret from Ohio. She tried harder. Tom had to give her that much. She planted a small garden by the front door and actually unpacked her bags. But when a vicious dust storm hit on the 6th day, turning the sky brown and the air thick enough to choke on, she packed everything again and swore she would rather die alone in Ohio than stay another single night in this God-forsaken wilderness. The third was Sarah from Boston. She arrived with fierce determination to civilize everything she touched. She brought lace curtains, fine china dishes, and a piano that had to be hauled up the mountain by 4 exhausted men who cursed the whole way. When Tom came home one evening to find his late mother's Apache blankets and sacred cooking tools thrown outside like common trash, something cold and permanent settled deep in his heart. He loaded Sarah and her precious piano back onto the wagon himself without saying a single word. After that humiliation, the mail-order agency in St. Louis sent Tom a polite letter suggesting he reconsider his circumstances before requesting another bride. Silver Creek laughed about it for weeks. Poor Tom Walker, they said, too savage for civilized women. But Tom Walker was stubborn, maybe even desperate. Living alone on a windswept ranch with only cattle and a horse for company would wear any man thin after enough years. His ranch hands came and went with the seasons, respectful but always distant. None of them stayed long enough to become friends. He was too Apache for the whites who feared what they did not understand, too Mexican for the Apache who saw his mixed blood as weakness, and far too much of everything for delicate Eastern women dreaming of tame Western husbands who would give them comfortable lives. So when Tom rode into Silver Creek one cool autumn morning, people noticed right away. He tied his paint horse outside the post office, his movements slow and deliberate like a man preparing himself for disappointment. His coat was worn but clean, his hat pulled low over watchful eyes. Mrs. Henderson noted with great interest that he had shaved, which always meant trouble was coming. Inside the cramped post office, the postmaster hesitated a long moment before handing over a single envelope. From Missouri this time, he said. Kansas City looks like. Tom tucked the letter into his coat without opening it. He would read it alone, away from the judgment of prying eyes. When the postmaster asked why he kept doing this to himself, Tom paused at the door and turned back. Ever watch a wolf circle a campfire on a cold night? He said quietly. It knows the fire might burn if it gets too close, but the cold out in the darkness will kill it for certain. The ride home carried Tom through harsh and unforgiving country. Red rock canyons rose around him like ancient cathedral walls. Thin trees clung to stone with desperate roots. The mountains in the distance were already dusted with early snow, a warning that winter would come hard this year. It was difficult land, dangerous land, land that had broken stronger men than Tom Walker. But it was his, the only thing in this world that truly belonged to him. When he finally reached the cabin and lit the lamp against the gathering darkness, Tom sat at his rough wooden table and opened the letter with hands that trembled slightly despite his best efforts to stay calm. Ruth Collins, 30 years old, matron at an orphanage in Kansas City, Missouri. She wrote in a clear, practical hand without any of the flowery language Tom had come to expect from mail-order correspondence. She did not describe herself as beautiful or accomplished or refined. She did not list her skills at piano playing or embroidery or any of the useless talents Eastern women seem to prize. Instead, she wrote that she did not fear silence or hard work, that she had lived surrounded by hundreds of people for 10 years and still known the deepest kind of loneliness, that she wanted a life with purpose and meaning, not comfort and ease. If you are still seeking a wife who will not flee at the first sign of hardship, she concluded, I am willing to write more. But I warn you now, Mr. Walker, I have no interest in pretty lies or comfortable illusions. Tell me the truth about your life, and I will tell you the truth about mine. Tom read the letter 3 times before he could believe it was real. He wrote back that same night, the lamp burning low as he struggled to find the right words. He did not soften the truth or paint prettier pictures than reality would support. He told her about the isolation that stretched for days without human contact. He told her about the brutal labor that never ended, season after season. He told her about the unforgiving land that showed no mercy to weakness. He offered no comfort, only honesty. Still, as he sealed the envelope with trembling fingers, he allowed himself a fragile sliver of hope. They exchanged 3 more letters over the following weeks as autumn deepened and the first hard frosts came to the valley. Ruth asked practical questions about water sources and winter severity and the nearest doctor. She asked about neighbors and fences and what skills would serve her best in such remote country. She did not ask about curtains or parties or social calls. She did not ask how often they might visit town for entertainment. Tom answered everything with the same brutal honesty. He described the isolation without apology or excuse. He told her about the ranch hands who came and went like passing seasons. He mentioned his Apache grandmother, Elena, who lived in the mountains and visited twice each year. He explained how winter could seal you in for weeks at a time with no possibility of escape. Ruth's final letter before her arrival was short and direct, exactly like the woman herself. I have made my decision, she wrote. I will arrive on the 23rd of October on the afternoon stage. Please do not meet me with false promises or pretty words. I expect only what you have honestly described. If you are willing to work beside a woman rather than in front of her, I believe we can build something worth having together. Tom read that letter more times than he would ever admit to anyone. On the 23rd of October, he stood at the Silver Creek Depot as the afternoon stage arrived in a cloud of dust. His heart hammered against his ribs like a wild animal trying to escape a trap. He had cleaned his coat twice, oiled his boots until they shone, and shaved again that morning with extra care. Mrs. Henderson watched from across the street with hungry eyes, already composing the gossip she would spread by sundown. Passengers climbed down one by one, a businessman in a rumpled suit complaining about the rough roads, a young mother with 2 crying children who looked exhausted beyond words, an old man who coughed violently into his sleeve. Then a woman stepped out without waiting for anyone to help her down. She carried only a leather satchel over one shoulder and a modest carpet bag in her hand. She wore a plain gray dress, practical rather than fashionable, without a single ribbon or piece of lace anywhere. Her dark hair was pinned back in a simple style that kept it out of her face. Her eyes were sharp and assessing, and they found Tom immediately across the crowded platform. Miss Collins, he said, removing his hat and holding it against his chest. Mr. Walker, she replied. Her voice was calm and direct, without the nervous flutter he had come to expect from Eastern women seeing the territory for the first time. They stood there for a moment in the dusty afternoon light, taking careful measure of each other while the whole town watched and whispered behind their hands. Tom noticed that she did not look frightened by what she saw. She did not look like a woman already planning her escape. She looked like someone who had made a hard decision after careful thought and intended to see it through no matter what came next. Shall we go? He said finally, gesturing toward his horse and wagon waiting nearby. Yes, she said with a small nod. I have a very long list of questions about the property. The ride toward the ranch took most of the long afternoon. Ruth sat beside Tom on the wagon bench, her carpet bag secure at her feet, her sharp eyes moving constantly across the landscape as it passed. She did not seem interested in small talk or nervous chatter. Instead, she studied the land with the careful attention of someone planning to stay. She asked about rainfall patterns and how long the dry seasons lasted. She asked about water sources and whether the creek ever ran completely dry. She asked about neighbors and fence lines and how far the property extended in each direction. She watched where trees grew thickest and where the soil looked richest, making mental notes that Tom could almost see forming behind her intelligent eyes. She did not ask about town or comforts or entertainment. When the ranch finally came into view as the sun began sinking toward the western mountains, Ruth studied it without any visible sign of fear or disappointment. The small cabin sat against the dramatic backdrop of massive snow-capped peaks. The barn looked weathered by decades of hard use, but still solid enough to last many more years. Cattle dotted the distant golden hills like scattered seeds. It is smaller than I imagined, she said finally, but well placed. The mountains provide excellent shelter from the worst winter winds. The valley allows for good drainage during spring thaws. The creek runs close enough for easy water access, but far enough to avoid flooding. Tom glanced at her with genuine surprise. You know something about land and property. Ruth nodded without any false modesty. The orphanage owned a small farm on the outskirts of Kansas City. I managed it for 6 years before the new director arrived. Children need to learn practical skills if they hope to survive in this world. I made sure they learned them properly. Inside the small house, she inspected everything quietly and thoroughly. The simple handmade furniture built for function rather than beauty. The functional kitchen with its cast iron stove and rough wooden counters. The single bedroom with its narrow bed and thin mattress. The Apache blankets and traditional cooking tools that Tom had kept after Sarah's disastrous attempt to throw them away like garbage. No tears fell from her calm eyes. No complaints crossed her lips. No wrinkled nose showed disgust at the modest accommodations. When Tom admitted awkwardly that the house merely existed and was not truly a home anymore, Ruth nodded thoughtfully as if he had made an important point. Then we will make it one together, she said simply. But first I need to understand the real work. Show me everything that keeps this ranch running. Hold nothing back because you think I cannot handle it. That night, as the wind howled mournfully outside and the fire crackled warm in the stone hearth, Tom realized something important had already changed. This woman had not come here to be protected or entertained like a fragile doll. She had come here to work. She had come here to build. And without either of them knowing it yet, the first week of testing had already begun. The first 7 days tested Ruth Collins in ways that no one in Silver Creek could have imagined. The land did not soften for her arrival or show any mercy to her inexperience. The wind cut just as sharply through her thin eastern clothes. The sun burned just as hard against her pale skin. The nights were just as quiet and endlessly long as they had been for every woman who came before her and failed. But Ruth did not cry. She did not complain. She did not ask when she could leave. On the first morning, Tom rose before dawn as was his unbreakable habit. He expected to find the house cold and silent, the way it had been with Charlotte and Margaret and Sarah during those early days when they were still too shocked and horrified to function properly. Instead, coffee was already heating over the rekindled fire. Ruth stood at the table with her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, sorting dried beans into neat piles by size and quality. She looked up as he entered, as if this were the most natural thing in the entire world. You rise early, she observed. I thought I should do the same if we are to work together. Tom said nothing. He could not find words. He simply nodded and poured himself a cup of coffee. It was strong and good, better than the bitter brew he usually made for himself. He noticed that Ruth had already tidied the kitchen area while he slept, organizing pots and utensils and supplies in a way that made far more sense than his haphazard arrangement. She had not asked permission or waited for instruction. She had simply seen what needed doing and done it. Each day that followed fell into the same productive pattern. Tom worked the cattle and fences from dawn until dusk. Ruth worked everything else, and then found more work to do. She cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, but not like someone trying to make things pretty for show. She cleaned like someone preparing a stronghold for survival. She reorganized the pantry so nothing would spoil or go to waste. She found tools Tom had not touched in years and put them back to useful work. She asked endless questions about the land, about storms, about where water ran during the dry months when the creek shrank to a trickle. She did not ask about town or when they might go there. By the third day, Tom noticed something else had changed. The house felt different when he came home at sunset, not decorated with useless ornaments, not softened with lace and ribbons, just alive in a way it had not been since his mother died all those years ago. Lamps were lit against the darkness when he walked through the door. Meals came at steady, predictable hours. There was order and purpose where there had only been lonely endurance before. On the fourth day, Tom returned from repairing the south fence to find Ruth outside in the yard, kneeling in the dirt, working on a loose hinge on the old chicken coop. Her gray dress was dusty at the knees and her hands were smudged with rust and oil. "We do not have chickens," Tom said, stopping his horse and staring down at her with confusion. Ruth did not even look up from her careful work. "We will have them soon," she replied calmly. "I traded some cloth with a woman at the general store before I left Pennsylvania. She promised to sell me 6 laying hens when I am ready for them. The coop needed repairs before I could bring them home." Tom sat on his horse watching her work for a long, silent moment, completely unsure what to say or think. No woman before her had ever planned that far ahead. No woman had ever assumed with such confidence that she would still be here long enough to raise chickens and gather eggs. He finally dismounted and walked toward where she knelt. "You know how to work hinges and hardware?" Ruth looked up at last, pushing a strand of dark hair back from her face with one dirty hand. "I know how to work most things that break, Mr. Walker. The orphanage never had money for professional repairs. We either learned to fix what broke ourselves or we went without. The children deserve better than going without." That night, after a dinner of beans and cornbread that Ruth had somehow made taste better than anything Tom had eaten in years, a cold wind rolled down from the mountains carrying the sound of coyotes and the unmistakable promise of weather turning harsh. Tom stepped onto the porch to check the sky and gauge what was coming. He expected to find himself alone with his thoughts as usual. Ruth was already there, her thin shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders against the biting wind. She stood at the porch rail staring out at the darkening land with an expression he could not read. Tom moved to stand beside her without speaking. They watched the last pale light fade from the sky while the wind pushed against them like a living thing testing their resolve. "It is very loud out here," Ruth said quietly after several minutes of comfortable silence. Tom glanced at her, confused by the strange observation. "The land makes noise," he agreed. "No, not the land." Ruth shook her head slowly, still staring at the darkness gathering over the mountains. "The silence itself. It is much louder than any city I have known." Tom understood exactly what she meant. The silence out here in the wilderness was not empty at all. It was full of sound if you knew how to listen. Wind and distant animals and creaking wood and your own heartbeat and your own thoughts echoing back at you without mercy. City people always expected quiet to mean peaceful rest. They never understood that true deep silence could be absolutely deafening. "You get used to it eventually," Tom said. Ruth nodded slowly. "I imagine you do. That or it drives you completely mad. Which one happened to you?" Ruth was quiet for a long, thoughtful moment before answering. "Neither," she said finally in a voice barely above a whisper. "I was already comfortable with silence before I ever came here. True loneliness does not require empty spaces, Mr. Walker. I learned that lesson many years ago." On the 5th day of Ruth's time at the ranch, a dust storm swept through the valley without any warning. Tom saw it coming from the south pasture where he was checking on a sick calf. A massive wall of brown rose from the horizon like something alive and hungry, blotting out the afternoon sun and turning the world the color of dried blood. He spurred his horse toward the house with his heart pounding in familiar dread. This was always when they broke. This was always when the crying started and the begging began and another failure became inevitable. He remembered Charlotte from Pennsylvania sobbing hysterically in the corner, convinced beyond any comfort that she was about to die in this God-forsaken wilderness. He remembered Margaret from Ohio shaking so violently with terror that she could not even speak coherent words. He remembered Sarah from Boston screaming useless orders through her frightened tears while accomplishing absolutely nothing helpful. When Tom burst through the cabin door with dust already swirling thick around him and stinging his eyes, he braced himself for the chaos he knew would be waiting. Instead, he found Ruth calmly closing the heavy wooden shutters one by one. "The windows are all secured now," she said without turning around to look at him. "I checked the water barrels twice and moved all the tools inside where they would not blow away. Is there anything else on the property that needs protecting before the storm hits?" Tom stood frozen in the doorway, dust whipping past him into the cabin, completely unable to process what he was witnessing. "The root cellar," he managed to say. "The door sticks sometimes." "Already closed and weighted down with stones," Ruth replied. She finished securing the last shutter and finally turned to face him. Her expression was calm and focused and completely untroubled. Not a trace of fear showed anywhere on her practical face. The storm hit the ranch with full, terrifying force just minutes later. Wind slammed against the cabin wall so hard the whole structure shuddered and groaned. Dust and grit seeped through every tiny crack and gap, coating everything in fine brown powder. The world outside the shuttered windows completely disappeared into howling brown chaos that sounded like the end of everything. Ruth sat down at the kitchen table and calmly began mending torn shirts from the pile she had found in a corner. Tom watched her with something approaching shock, still unable to believe what he was seeing. "Are you not frightened at all?" Ruth looked up from her neat, careful stitches, one eyebrow raised in mild curiosity. "Frightened of what, exactly?" "The storm will pass when it passes. The house is solid enough to survive much worse than this. We have food and water to last for days. Being frightened would not change any of those facts. So what purpose would it serve?" She returned to her mending without waiting for an answer, her stitches perfectly even, despite the howling wind rattling the shutters and the dust falling like dirty snow from the ceiling beams. At the orphanage, she continued after a moment, many of the children were absolutely terrified of storms. They would cry and scream and make themselves sick with fear. "I learned early on that panic spreads faster than fire. If I stayed calm, the children eventually stayed calm too. If I showed even a moment of fear, they fed on it, and everything spiraled into disaster. So I taught myself to be steady no matter what was happening outside." The storm raged violently for hours without mercy. The cabin creaked and groaned and shuddered, but held firm against the onslaught. Ruth finished mending 3 shirts, started on a 4th, made a simple dinner of preserved meat and bread, and went to bed at her usual time, as if nothing unusual was happening at all. Tom lay awake in his bedroll by the fire long after she fell asleep, listening to the wind howling like tortured souls and wondering who this remarkable woman really was beneath her calm exterior. On the 6th day, Ruth reorganized the root cellar completely, while Tom worked on repairing damage the storm had caused to the barn roof. She emerged hours later covered in cobwebs and dust and carrying a detailed list of everything they had and everything they would need to survive the coming winter. "We have enough food for approximately 3 weeks if we are careful with portions," she reported. While washing her hands in the basin, "The preserves from last summer are still perfectly good. The dried meat is holding well, but we need much more variety in our stores for next winter. I noticed some empty jars that could be put to better use for preserving." Tom took the list from her hand and stared at it in amazement. She had inventoried everything in the cellar down to individual jars and bags, noting quantities and conditions and estimated expiration dates. "You did all this in one morning?" "There was nothing else pressing that needed doing," Ruth said with a small shrug. "Idle hands make idle minds. My mother taught me that before she died, and I have never forgotten the lesson." On the morning of the 7th day, Tom woke before dawn with tension coiled so tight in his chest he could barely breathe. This was the day that every other woman had finally broken down completely. Charlotte had fled in hysterical tears on day 4. Margaret had demanded to leave on day 6. Sarah had lasted exactly 7 days before packing her bags and refusing to spend another moment in this horrible place. Tom forced himself out of bed and walked into the main room of the cabin, expecting to find Ruth packing her things or crying by the cold fireplace, or simply gone without a word. Instead, he found her kneeling by the hearth, coaxing the morning fire back to life with practiced hands, coffee already set to heat. She looked up when she heard his footsteps and nodded a calm greeting, as if this were any other ordinary morning. Tom watched her carefully all through breakfast, waiting for a question about leaving or a crack in her composure or anything that would signal the beginning of the end. Instead, she asked about fence lines. Which section of fence fails most often during winter storms? Tom blinked, caught off guard by the practical question. The eastern draw, he answered after a moment. The wind comes through that gap hardest, and the posts are older there. Ruth nodded thoughtfully, filing the information away. Then I should learn that section well. If something happens to the fence while you are gone checking on cattle, I need to know how to repair it myself or at least secure it temporarily until you return. Tom set down his coffee cup. You want to learn fence repair? I want to learn everything about how this ranch works, Ruth said simply, meeting his eyes directly. A ranch wife who cannot maintain the ranch during emergencies is not truly a wife. She is a burden. I refuse to be a burden to anyone. They walked the eastern fence line together that afternoon under a sky washed clean and blue by the previous days of wind. Ruth listened closely while Tom explained how cattle behaved when they sensed weakness in fence lines, how wires snapped under pressure in certain predictable ways, how to read the land and anticipate where breaks would likely come before they actually happened. She did not pretend to have strength she did not possess. She asked clarifying questions when she did not fully understand something. She freely admitted when a task seemed beyond her current physical ability. But she learned. She absorbed every piece of information like dry ground drinking rain. When they finally returned to the cabin at sunset, both tired and dusty from the long walk, Ruth paused on the porch and turned to face Tom directly. "Mr. Walker," she said. Tom stopped and looked at her, waiting. "I know what day this is," Ruth said quietly but firmly. "I know the other women were gone by now. I know you are waiting for me to break or run or beg to be taken back to town." Tom said nothing. He could not deny the truth of her words. "I am not leaving," Ruth continued, her voice steady and certain. "I came here to build something real with my own hands. I came here to find purpose and meaning. I am not going to abandon that purpose just because the work is hard, or the land is harsh, or the nights are lonely." Tom stood frozen on the porch steps, unable to find any words that felt adequate. Ruth nodded once, as if confirming something important to herself, then turned and went inside to start preparing dinner. Tom remained on the porch alone for a long time, watching the sun sink behind the mountains and paint the sky in shades of orange and red and gold. For the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to truly hope. That evening, as darkness settled over the valley and Ruth served a simple meal of beans and cornbread by lamplight, heavy clouds began rolling in from the northwest. They piled up against the mountain peaks like gray wool blankets, thick and ominous and full of moisture. Tom stepped outside to check the sky and felt the air temperature dropping rapidly against his face. This was not another dust storm. This was something different, something worse. Snow was coming early this year. By midnight, the first fat white flakes began falling from the black sky. By dawn, 3 inches of powder covered the ground. By noon, the snow was falling so thick and fast that Tom could not see the barn from the cabin window. They were trapped. Tom realized with a sinking feeling that he and this woman he barely knew would be confined together in this small cabin for days, possibly weeks, with nowhere to escape and nothing to do but survive each other's constant company. For most men, this would have been a nightmare of awkward silences and growing tensions. For Tom Walker, it became something else entirely. The blizzard raged for 4 brutal days without mercy. Snow piled against the cabin doors so high that Tom had to force them open each morning with his shoulder. Wind screamed across the valley like something wounded and furious, rattling the shutters and finding every tiny gap in the cabin walls. The world beyond the frosted windows disappeared completely into endless, swirling white that made it impossible to tell where earth ended and sky began. Tom had survived many winters alone on this ranch. He knew how to ration food carefully and conserve precious firewood and keep himself sane through long days of forced isolation. But he had never been trapped with another person in such close quarters for so long, and he braced himself for the worst. He expected Ruth to grow restless and irritable as the hours crawled past. He expected complaints about the boredom and the cold and the primitive conditions. He expected demands for entertainment or conversation or some escape from the endless monotony of waiting. Instead, Ruth transformed their confinement into unexpected progress. On the first full day of the blizzard, Ruth completely reorganized the Rudolph cellar while Tom spent exhausting hours clearing accumulated snow from the doorway so it would not freeze solid and trap them inside. She emerged hours later covered in dust and cobwebs, carrying a detailed list of everything they possessed and everything they would need to acquire before next winter. "We have enough provisions for 3 weeks if we are careful with portions," she reported matter-of-factly. "The vegetable preserves from last summer are still perfectly good. The dried meat is holding its quality well. But we will need much more variety in our winter stores going forward." I noticed several empty jars that could be put to productive use. Tom took the handwritten list from her and stared at it in genuine amazement. She had inventoried every single item in the cellar, noting quantities and conditions and estimated dates when things might spoil. "You accomplished all this in a single morning?" "There was nothing else productive to do while waiting out the storm," Ruth said with a small, practical shrug. "Idle hands lead to idle minds. My mother taught me that lesson before she passed, and I have carried it with me ever since." On the second day of confinement, while wind howled endlessly outside and snow continued falling in thick white curtains, Tom repaired harnesses and bridles by the fire, while Ruth inventoried every tool, pot, pan, and piece of equipment in the cabin. She found useful items Tom had completely forgotten he owned, buried in corners and tucked behind furniture. She set aside everything that needed mending and made careful notes about things that should be replaced when they could get to town again. That evening, as firelight flickered warm against the log walls and the storm raged impotent outside, Ruth asked Tom about the Apache grinding stones tucked into a dark corner of the kitchen. Tom went completely still at the question. Those worn, smooth stones were among the very few things he still had from his mother. The beautiful Apache blankets that Sarah had thrown away like garbage were gone forever, replaced by cheaper trade blankets that held no meaning or memory. But the grinding stones remained, gathering dust in their corner because Tom could not bear to use them and could not bear to throw them away. "My mother used those," he said quietly, his voice rough with old grief. "Every morning when I was young, the sound of stone against stone was how I knew she was awake and the day had begun." Ruth nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than pitying. She did not offer hollow sympathy or ask intrusive questions about his mother's death or his complicated feelings about her loss. "Then we should use them again," she said simply. "Good tools deserve purpose. Honoring them through use seems better than letting them gather dust in a forgotten corner." She did not ask him to throw away any of his mother's things. She did not try to replace his family's possessions with her own. She simply suggested that sacred objects be honored through continued use rather than abandoned to neglect. That night, Tom showed Ruth how to grind corn the traditional Apache way, the way his mother had patiently taught him when he was barely old enough to walk. The ancient sound of stone against stone filled the small kitchen with its rhythmic music, and for the first time in many years, the cabin felt like the warm home it had been when Tom was a child with a mother who loved him. On the third night of the blizzard, with the storm showing no signs of weakening and the snow piled higher than the windows, Ruth finally spoke about her own past. They sat together by the crackling fire after a simple dinner of preserved meat and the cornbread Ruth had made using the freshly ground meal. Tom had grown comfortable with their easy silences over the past days, but tonight Ruth seemed ready to share more of herself. "You must wonder," she began slowly, staring into the dancing flames, "why a woman would agree to marry a complete stranger and travel halfway across the country to live in a place she has never seen." Tom glanced at her weathered profile in the firelight. The thought had crossed my mind more than once. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, collecting her thoughts. Her expression remained calm, but something old and carefully controlled flickered behind her intelligent eyes, something she had kept hidden for a very long time. "The orphanage where I worked in Kansas City was run by a man named Director Wallace," she said finally. "He was powerful and influential throughout the city, wealthy from family money, well-connected to politicians and businessmen. Everyone in polite society thought he was a great philanthropist, a generous man dedicating his life to helping unfortunate children." Tom heard the subtle shift in her voice, the slight hardening of her tone. What was he really behind closed doors? Ruth stared into the fire, her jaw tight. He was the kind of man who believes power gives him the right to own whatever he wants. He decided after I had worked there for 5 years that he wanted me, not as a wife to honor and respect, just as something he could possess and use and discard when he grew bored. Tom felt his whole body tense with sudden anger on her behalf. He understood exactly what kind of man she was describing. The territory was full of them, hiding behind respectable facades. I refused him, Ruth continued, her voice flat and controlled. He did not take my refusal gracefully. He started making my work impossible in small ways at first, then larger ones, cutting supplies for the children I cared for, blaming me publicly for problems he had deliberately created, threatening to have me dismissed without references and blacklisted from any respectable position in the entire city. Why did you not report him to the authorities? To whom exactly? Ruth's voice carried no bitterness, only weary resignation. He sat on every charitable board in Kansas City, his word against mine. A powerful, wealthy man against an unmarried woman who worked with unwanted orphan children. Who do you think would have been believed? So you chose to leave on your own terms. Ruth nodded slowly, still watching the flames dance. I did not run because I was weak or frightened, Mr. Walker. I left because I refused to become small. I refused to let him slowly destroy me or turn me into something afraid and broken and pathetic. When I saw the advertisement for mail-order brides seeking new lives in the Western Territories, I realized I could choose my own escape rather than wait for him to finish destroying everything I had built. Tom absorbed this revelation in heavy silence. He had assumed Ruth came west seeking adventure or romance, or some naive fantasy about frontier life. He had never imagined she was fleeing something much darker and more dangerous. You came here to survive, he said quietly. Ruth turned her head to look at him directly, her eyes bright in the firelight. I came here to truly live, she said firmly. There is an important difference between those things. Surviving means you merely endure whatever happens to you. Living means you actively choose what happens next. Tom felt something shift deep in his chest. An old wall he had carefully built years ago, a wall meant to protect him from the inevitable disappointment and rejection that came with every failed relationship, began to crack and crumble. This remarkable woman had not come west looking for rescue. She had not come expecting Tom or any other man to save her from her troubles. She had come to save herself. And somehow, impossibly, that made her the strongest person Tom Walker had ever met in his entire life. On the fourth morning of the blizzard, Tom woke to a silence so complete and sudden, it felt like a physical presence pressing against his ears. No howling wind rattling the shutters, no snow hissing against the frozen windows, just pale morning light filtering through cracks in the heavy wooden shutters and the distant drip of melting ice. The storm had finally broken. Tom rose quietly from his bedroll by the fire, not wanting to wake Ruth, and forced open the cabin door against the wall of snow packed outside. The world had completely transformed overnight. Clean white snow covered absolutely everything as far as he could see. The mountains in the distance glittered in the early sunlight like they were carved from pure crystal. The valley stretched silent and impossibly beautiful in every direction, unmarked by any track or shadow. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Ruth stepped onto the buried porch, wrapped warmly in one of his mother's traditional Apache blankets. She had not asked permission to use it. She had simply found it in a trunk somewhere, recognized it for what it was, and claimed it as something practical and necessary. She stood beside Tom in the deep snow and watched the sun rise slowly over the transformed ranch. I suppose we should begin clearing paths, she said after a long, comfortable silence. Check on the animals in the barn. Start digging out before the snow freezes solid. Tom nodded in agreement, but for a moment neither of them moved to begin the work. I have been trapped inside that cabin for 4 days, Ruth said quietly, her breath making small clouds in the frozen air. Confined with a man who was a stranger to me. Tom glanced at her, waiting. I have survived worse confinements in my life, Ruth continued thoughtfully, but I have never actually enjoyed one before now. She turned and went back inside to start preparing breakfast, leaving Tom alone on the porch with snow crunching under his boots and a strange warmth spreading through his chest despite the freezing air. Ruth Collins had survived longer than any woman before her. She had already passed every brutal test the land could throw at her, and she had done it all without a single complaint, without tears, without asking when she could finally leave. When Tom came inside 20 minutes later, stamping snow from his boots, The cabin glowed warm with lamplight and the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Ruth looked up from the stove as he entered. "You stayed," Tom said quietly, the words catching in his throat. Ruth's expression did not change, but something softened in her eyes. Where would I possibly go? Those four simple words hit Tom harder than any passionate declaration of love ever could have. Days turned into weeks as the deep snow slowly retreated under the winter sun. Muddy patches appeared in the valley, then small streams of meltwater. Then finally the first tentative green shoots of new grass pushing through the sodden earth. Silver Creek waited eagerly for news of Tom Walker's latest failure. Quiet bets were placed among the townspeople, odds calculated on how much longer that strange Eastern woman would last before running back to civilization where she belonged. But Ruth Collins did not count days like a prisoner marking time until release. She planned entire seasons. Tom watched her steady transformation of the ranch with something approaching wonder and disbelief. She acquired 6 laying hens from the widow in town who had promised them, and within 2 weeks the chicken coop she had repaired was producing fresh eggs every morning. She started planning an ambitious vegetable garden, sketching careful layouts on scraps of brown paper, asking Tom detailed questions about soil quality and growing seasons and which crops thrived in the harsh mountain climate. She never asked his permission to make these improvements to their shared life. She simply identified what needed doing and did it without waiting for approval or direction. One crisp afternoon in early spring, Tom returned from checking on the cattle herd to find Ruth balanced precariously on the cabin roof, hammering patches over a leak that had bothered him for nearly 2 years without him ever getting around to fixing it. "How did you get up there?" he called up to her, his heart lurching painfully at the sight of her balanced on the weathered shingles 30 feet above the hard ground. "Same way anyone does," Ruth called back without pausing her work. "I found the ladder in the barn and climbed it carefully." "You could fall and break your neck." Ruth paused her hammering and looked down at him with one eyebrow raised in mild amusement. "I could also get kicked by one of your horses, struck dead by lightning, or bitten by a rattlesnake hiding in the woodpile. Should I stop all activity that carries some risk of injury?" Tom had absolutely no answer for that unassailable logic. The leak was completely repaired before sunset. Winter settled fully over the ranch as the weeks passed, slow and heavy and relentless. Life narrowed to the essentials of survival: warmth, food, work that absolutely could not wait regardless of weather. Tom taught Ruth how to properly handle and maintain a rifle, not because he expected immediate trouble, but because every person living on a remote frontier ranch needed to know how to protect themselves and their property. Ruth learned without a single word of complaint or hesitation. Her aim improved steadily with dedicated practice. By the deep, cold heart of midwinter, she could consistently hit a target at 50 yards more often than she missed. "I do not enjoy the thought of killing any living thing," she admitted one quiet evening as they sat together cleaning the guns by warm firelight. "Neither do I," Tom said, honestly. "Never have." Ruth nodded thoughtfully, running an oiled cloth along the rifle barrel with practiced efficiency. "But I would kill without hesitation to protect what is ours. That is very different from enjoying the act itself." Ours. The word hung in the cold air between them like a promise. Neither commented on its significance. During those long, dark winter months of forced closeness, Tom found himself talking more than he had in years, perhaps more than he had talked to anyone in his entire adult life. Ruth asked thoughtful questions about his childhood, about his Apache heritage, and the traditions his mother had taught him about his Mexican father, who had died before Tom was old enough to form any real memories of him. She listened without judgment or pity. She never tried to fix or explain or minimize his complicated feelings about his mixed blood and his place between two worlds that both rejected him. In return, Ruth gradually shared stories from her decade at the Kansas City orphanage. She told him about frightened children who arrived at her door scared and broken and left her care years later standing strong and confident. She described the small, hard-won victories of teaching a troubled boy to read or helping a shy girl find her voice. She admitted the heartbreaks of watching children as she loved return to families who clearly did not deserve them. "There was a little girl named Mary," Ruth said one cold night, her voice soft with old grief, 7 years old when she came to us. Her father had beaten her so badly she could not walk properly for nearly a week. When he came to take her back 6 months later, The law said I had to surrender her. There was nothing I could legally do to stop it. Tom felt physically sick at the image her words painted. What happened to her after that? Ruth stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. I do not know. That is the very worst part of it. Not knowing what became of her. I saved every penny I could spare for 3 years trying to hire a lawyer who would help me change the laws about returning children to abusive homes. It was not nearly enough. It was never enough. Is that why you finally left Kansas City? Ruth shook her head slowly. That is why I stayed as long as I did, actually. Those children needed someone who would not give up on them no matter how hard things became. But Director Wallace made it impossible for me to continue helping anyone. So I had to find another way to do something meaningful with my life. And you think this life here matters? Tom gestured at the small cabin around them, the endless snow visible through the frosted windows, the isolated ranch that most people would consider the middle of nowhere. This seems meaningful to you? Ruth turned to look at him directly, her eyes bright with conviction in the firelight. Building something real and lasting with your own hands matters. Creating a true home where there was only survival matters. Proving that hard ground can grow strong roots matters. She nodded firmly. Yes, I believe this matters more than most things in this world. When trouble finally came to challenge the Walker Ranch, it arrived quietly and without warning. A neighboring rancher named Harrison Garrett had recently purchased land in the valley. He was loud, aggressive, and absolutely certain that his considerable wealth made him the most important person in any room he entered. One cold afternoon in late winter, he rode up to Tom's fence line with 2 hired hands and a long list of invented complaints. Your cattle crossed onto my land last week, Garrett shouted across the fence, his face red with manufactured outrage. They damaged my property significantly. I expect full compensation for my losses. Tom rode out calmly to meet him at the boundary line. Ruth followed on her own horse despite Tom's quiet suggestion that she might want to stay behind at the cabin. Show me this damage you claim, Tom said evenly, keeping his voice calm and his hands visible. Garrett's cold eyes slid dismissively past Tom to settle on Ruth with obvious contempt. Who is this? Your Apache squaw? Tom felt every muscle in his body tense with sudden fury. Ruth's expression did not change by even a flicker. This is my wife, Tom said in a voice gone dangerously quiet. You will show her proper respect, or you will leave my property immediately. Garrett snorted with amusement, not recognizing the warning signs of a man near violence. Wife? He looked Ruth up and down with obvious disdain, making no effort to hide his assessment. Another mail order failure, I heard. How long until this one runs off crying back to wherever she came from? Ruth spoke before Tom could respond, her voice calm and clear and completely unintimidated by the much larger man on his expensive horse. The eastern fence line is clearly marked with posts and wire, Mr. Garrett. I walked every foot of it myself just last week after the snow melted enough to make inspection possible. If your cattle somehow crossed onto our property, that is entirely your responsibility to prevent, not ours to compensate. Perhaps you should invest in better fencing and more competent ranch hands before accusing your neighbors of imaginary damages. Garrett's weathered face reddened with anger at being addressed so directly by a woman. I was not speaking to you, he snarled. But I am speaking to you, Ruth replied without raising her voice. And I am telling you clearly that baseless accusations will not be tolerated from you or anyone else. If you have actual evidence of genuine damage to your property caused by our animals, present it properly through legal channels. Otherwise, remove yourself from our land before my husband removes you himself, Garrett sputtered with outrage, his mouth opening and closing without producing words. He looked at his 2 hired hands as if expecting them to share his righteous indignation. Both men carefully avoided meeting his eyes. Tom moved his horse forward, positioning himself directly between Garrett and Ruth. My wife speaks for this ranch, he said quietly but clearly. You will listen to what she says, or you will leave. Those are your only options. Garrett glared at both of them for a long, tense moment, clearly calculating the odds and not liking what he found. Then he wheeled his horse around violently and rode away without another word. His hired hands followed at a careful distance. That night, as Ruth served a simple dinner of stew and fresh bread, Tom waited for her to ask the question he had been dreading ever since his first 3 marriages fell apart. Why did the others truly fail? Ruth asked without preamble, not bothering with gentle lead-ins, not the dust storms or the isolation or any of the obvious reasons. The real reason underneath all of that. Tom set down his spoon and considered how to answer honestly. He had never spoken about this to anyone before. I tried to protect them from everything, he admitted finally. I kept them separate from the real hard work of running this place. I thought if I could shield them from the worst hardships, they might find it easier to stay. Ruth nodded slowly. You offered them shelter instead of partnership. Yes. You treated them like fragile guests in a life that demanded full belonging. Tom nodded heavily, finally understanding his own mistakes. I thought that was kindness. I thought making things easier would make them want to stay. Instead, it made them feel useless and unwelcome, like they did not truly belong here and never could. Ruth reached across the rough wooden table and placed her strong, calloused hand over his. Her touch was warm and steady and real. You never asked them to help you build this life, she said gently. That was the crucial difference. You gave them a finished product to accept or reject, rather than raw materials to shape together. Tom looked at her hand covering his, marveling at how natural and right it felt. No, he said quietly, I never asked them. I did not know how. But you asked me. Tom met her intelligent eyes across the table. I did not have to ask. You started building from the very first morning. Ruth smiled. It was the first genuine, unguarded smile he had ever seen from her, small but absolutely real. Then perhaps, she said, we are finally getting somewhere worth going. By the time the snow fully retreated and spring spread warm and green across the valley, Ruth Collins was no longer seen as just another temporary visitor who would soon flee back east where she belonged. The Sandoval family, Mexican farmers who worked a modest spread half a day's ride to the west, began coming to the Walker Ranch regularly. Food was traded between the households. Heavy work was shared when extra hands were needed. When town gossip about the strange Eastern woman at Tom Walker's place reached the Sandoval dinner table, it died there without being repeated. Ruth did not waste her time answering rumors with words. She answered them with actions. When Maria Sandoval's youngest child fell desperately ill with a burning fever that would not break, Ruth rode through freezing rain for hours to bring medicine and traditional remedies. She stayed at the Sandoval home for 3 full days, nursing the boy back to health with patient care and accumulated wisdom from her years at the orphanage. When unexpected spring floods threatened to wash away the Sandoval's lower pasture and ruin their entire year's planting, both Tom and Ruth rode out before dawn to help build sandbag walls against the rising water. In return, the Sandoval family became fierce defenders of the Walker household against anyone who dared question them. She is good people, Miguel Sandoval told the assembled crowd at the Silver Creek General Store one busy Saturday afternoon, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. Better people than most of you who talk behind her back while she works harder than any of you ever will. The gossip in Silver Creek did not stop entirely, but it grew much quieter after that. Tom's grandmother, Elena, came down from her mountain home in early spring, making the difficult journey specifically because she had heard rumors about yet another woman living at her grandson's ranch. Elena Walker was pure Apache, 80 winters old according to her own count, and sharper in mind and eye than most people half her age. She had not approved of any of Tom's previous mail-order brides. She had not even bothered making the long trip to meet Charlotte or Margaret or Sarah, dismissing them sight unseen as unsuitable. But she came to meet Ruth. For 3 full days, Elena watched everything Ruth did with ancient dark eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She did not offer to help with any task. She did not speak except to answer direct questions. She simply observed with the patient intensity of a hawk, watching potential prey, making her own silent judgments. Ruth did not alter her behavior or try to impress the formidable old woman. She went about her daily work exactly as usual, rising early, tending her chickens, maintaining the house, working alongside Tom on whatever tasks needed doing that day. She treated Elena with genuine respect, but not fearful deference. On the 4th morning, as Ruth kneaded bread dough at the kitchen table, while pale spring sunlight streamed through the windows, Elena finally broke her long silence. You do not fear me, the old woman said in her halting, careful English. Ruth looked up from her work, her flour-covered hands still moving rhythmically. Should I be afraid of you? Elena studied her for a long, measured moment, her weathered face unreadable. Then, completely unexpectedly, she laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound like wind moving through dead winter leaves. Tom's other women were afraid of everything they encountered here, Elena said. The hard land frightened them. The endless work frightened them. The deep silence frightened them. And yes, I frightened them most of all. Ruth shrugged without stopping her kneading. I have been afraid of things in my life, real and serious things that deserved my fear. An old woman watching me make bread does not qualify as one of them. Elena laughed again, louder this time, a genuine sound of surprised delight. She crossed the small kitchen slowly and placed a weathered brown hand on Ruth's strong shoulder. This woman has true strength, she announced, turning to look at Tom where he stood watching from the doorway. She belongs in this place. She has earned it. It was the closest thing to a blessing and approval that Tom had ever heard his grandmother give to anyone. As spring warmed into summer and the valley turned lush and green with new growth, Tom and Ruth fell into a partnership rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. They woke together before dawn each day. They worked side by side through the long daylight hours without needing to explain or direct. They ate meals together in comfortable silence or easy conversation depending on their moods. They talked in the evenings about plans for improving the ranch, problems that needed solving, hopes for what they might build in seasons to come. They did not speak of love. Neither of them seemed to need the word spoken aloud. One warm evening in late spring, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun sink in blazing colors behind the western mountains, Tom finally asked the question that had been growing in his chest for weeks. Ruth. She turned her head to look at him, her eyes reflecting the golden light. I know we agreed to give this arrangement time, Tom said slowly, struggling to find adequate words for feelings he had never learned to properly express. We said we would see if living together actually worked before making anything permanent between us. Ruth waited patiently, giving him space to find his way to the point. But I think I already know the answer, Tom continued. I do not want to do any of this without you anymore. Not the ranch, not the work, not any part of this life. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. The last rays of sunlight painted her face in shades of gold and shadow. Are you asking me to formally marry you, Thomas Walker? Tom nodded, feeling his heart pound against his ribs. No grand speech or pretty poetry. Just the honest truth. Yes, I am asking you to be my wife in truth, not just in arrangement. Ruth considered his proposal the way she considered every important decision. Carefully, practically, without sentiment clouding her clear judgment. Marriage would give me legal security, she said finally, thinking out loud. Standing in the community. Protection for everything we have built together over these months. Tom felt his hope waver. He had wished for more than practical considerations, more than a business arrangement between partners. But Ruth was not finished speaking. It would also make you my true husband, she continued, her voice softening noticeably. In fact and in feeling, not a just inconvenient arrangement. Tom looked at her weathered profile in the fading light. Is that something you actually want? Ruth turned to meet his eyes directly. I did not come to this place looking for love, she said honestly. I came looking for purpose, for a chance to build something real and lasting with my own two hands. And now, what do you want now? Now I have found something I never expected to find, someone I never expected to meet. She reached across the small space between them and took his rough hand in hers. Yes, Thomas, I will marry you. The wedding ceremony was small and simple, exactly as both of them wanted. A traveling priest who happened through Silver Creek that month. The entire Sandoval family, dressed in their best clothes. Two loyal ranch hands who had worked for Tom long enough to earn an invitation to witness. Elena, who had made the difficult journey down from her mountain home specifically for this occasion. No music played, no expensive finery decorated the simple cabin. Ruth wore a clean dress she had sewn herself from practical fabric. Tom wore his father's good coat, the one family heirloom he still possessed, patched carefully in 3 places, but still respectable enough for the occasion. When the priest spoke the solemn vows, they answered in plain, strong voices without theatrical emotion. Neither made promises they could not realistically keep. Neither pretended to feel things they did not actually know. When the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife in the eyes of God and law, They did not kiss performatively for the watching crowd. They simply looked at each other and nodded once. Partners, bound together officially now, an agreement that truly mattered. That night, after this wedding, guests had departed and the small cabin had grown quiet, Ruth stood at the window looking out at the land they now owned together under the law. Tom came up behind her, hesitant and uncertain. This was new territory for both of them. Everything before had been careful partnership and practical arrangement. This was something different and more vulnerable. Ruth turned to face him. Whatever fear or uncertainty she might have been feeling was invisible on her calm, steady face. She looked at him the way she looked at every new challenge life presented. Directly, without flinching. Ready. "I suppose we should figure this part out together as well," she said. Tom almost smiled. "Seems like we figure most things out together now," Ruth nodded. "Then let us add this to the growing list." Whatever passed between them that night stayed forever between them alone. But in the morning light, something fundamental had changed in how they moved around each other. The careful, practical distance that had always existed between them, respectful and businesslike, had softened into something warmer. Not the passionate, romantic love that poets wrote dramatic verses about, something quieter and perhaps stronger. Deep understanding between two people who had chosen each other. Life did not grow softer or easier after the wedding ceremony made their partnership official. If anything, the demands of the ranch increased as the seasons turned. Spring brought new calves that needed constant watching and care, damaged fences that needed repair after winter storms, fields that needed plowing and planting in the narrow window between frost and summer heat. Summer brought brutal waves of dry heat and the endless worry about water levels in the creek and the ever-present threat of wildfires sweeping down from the dry mountains. Fall brought the frantic rush to harvest everything they had grown, preserve enough food for winter, and prepare the animals and buildings for another long season of snow. Tom and Ruth worked through every challenge side by side, never questioning whether they could handle what came next. Some exhausted nights, they fell into their shared beds so tired they could barely manage to say goodnight before sleep claimed them. Other quieter nights, they sat together on the porch watching stars wheel overhead, making detailed plans for the ranch, sharing fragments of their separate pasts, slowly learning every hidden corner of each other's complicated histories. It was Ruth who first noticed the subtle changes happening in her own body. She woke one gray morning feeling queasy in a way she had never experienced before, a rolling nausea that came in waves without any obvious cause. She dismissed it at first as something she had eaten, disagreeing with her. But the same sickness came again the next morning, and the morning after that. By the fourth morning of unexplained nausea, Ruth knew with quiet certainty what was happening inside her. She found Tom in the barn that evening, brushing down his favorite horse after a long day checking on cattle in the far pastures. He looked up when she entered the dim building, and something in her expression made him immediately stop what he was doing. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Ruth said carefully. She stood there in the dusty barn light for a moment, uncertain how to deliver news she had never truly expected to give. "I think we need to start preparing for something." "Preparing for what?" Ruth took a steadying breath. "I believe I am carrying a child." Tom went absolutely still. The brush hung motionless in his frozen hand. His horse stamped with impatience at the sudden interruption of grooming, completely ignored. "You are certain as I can be without a doctor's examination." "But yes, I have seen this happen enough times with women at the orphanage to recognize all the early signs." Tom carefully set down the brush and turned to face her fully. 100 different emotions crossed his weathered face in rapid succession: shock, disbelief, fear, dawning hope, wonder at the possibility. He stood silent for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what she had told him. Then he simply nodded once, accepting this new reality the same way he accepted everything else life threw at him. "Then we start preparing immediately." It was the most Tom Walker response possible. No dramatic outbursts or theatrical declarations, just calm acceptance and practical forward motion. They prepared together as they did everything now. Ruth continued working until her body clearly told her she needed to stop and rest. She modified her daily tasks as her belly gradually swelled, shifting from heavy physical labor to work she could safely manage in her condition. Tom stayed closer to the cabin than usual without smothering her with excessive concern, checking on her progress more often than strictly necessary, but never once treating her like she was fragile or incapable. Elena made the long, difficult journey down from her mountain home when word reached her about the expected baby. She spent 2 full weeks at the ranch, teaching Ruth traditional Apache methods for maintaining health during pregnancy and preparing for birth. She shared knowledge carefully passed down through countless generations of women who had borne children in a harsh, unforgiving country. Tom watched his grandmother and his wife spend long hours together, speaking in a comfortable mixture of English and Apache words and gestures that seemed to transcend any single language. He had never seen Elena warm to any person so quickly and completely. "This one has good, strong hips," Elena announced one evening over dinner, nodding approvingly at Ruth across the table. "And powerful spirit that will not break. The baby will be healthy and strong." Ruth accepted the assessment with the same practical attitude she brought to every other aspect of her life. "Good hips," she agreed. "I was built for hard work from the beginning. Hopefully that includes this kind of work as well." The birth finally came on a bitter January night, with snow falling soft and silent outside the cabin windows. Ruth had been uncomfortable and restless all day, pacing the small house constantly, unable to sit still or find any comfortable position. Tom recognized the signs from years of watching cattle give birth to calves, though he would never have been foolish enough to say that comparison out loud to Ruth. When the real pains started coming in earnest, Elena took complete charge of the situation. She had delivered dozens of babies in her long lifetime, including Tom himself all those years ago. She issued calm, steady orders, setting water to boil on the stove, laying out clean cloths on every available surface, positioning Ruth on the bed she had carefully prepared over previous days. Tom was firmly sent to wait in the main room of the cabin. The hours that followed were the longest and most difficult of his entire life. He heard Ruth cry out twice, sharp sounds of pain that cut through the cabin walls and stabbed directly into his chest. He heard Elena's voice, low and steady and reassuring, speaking words he could not quite make out. He heard movement and footsteps, and the occasional clatter of metal against wood. He paced. He prayed to gods he was not entirely sure he believed in. He sat down and immediately stood back up, unable to remain still. Then he heard something completely different. A high, thin cry, unmistakably new, unmistakably alive. Tom stood frozen in the middle of the cabin, unable to move or breathe until Elena appeared in the bedroom doorway. Her ancient face was tired but deeply satisfied. "You have a son," she announced. "Strong lungs, loud voice. He will survive." Tom pushed past her into the small bedroom. Ruth lay propped against several pillows, exhausted beyond any tiredness Tom had ever seen on her face. Her hair was damp and tangled with sweat. Her face was pale as winter snow. But she was smiling. In her arms, wrapped carefully in one of Tom's mother's traditional Apache blankets, was a tiny wrinkled creature with dark hair and a red scrunched face. Ruth looked up at Tom, standing frozen in the doorway. "Come meet your son." Tom crossed the room on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. He stopped beside the bed and looked down at the impossibly small baby cradled in his wife's arms. His son, his child, his family continuing. Something he had never truly dared to hope for. The baby's eyes were closed, his tiny fists clenched tight, his small mouth working in instinctive motions. He was the most perfect thing Tom had ever seen in his entire life. "What do we call him?" Tom asked, his voice rough with emotions he could not name. Ruth considered the question thoughtfully, as she considered everything important. "I thought perhaps Samuel," she said finally. "After the prophet who was given to the temple, a child dedicated to something greater than himself." Tom reached down carefully with one rough, calloused finger and touched his son's impossibly soft cheek. The baby stirred slightly, turned his tiny face toward the warmth of his father's hand, and settled back into peaceful sleep. "Samuel," Tom repeated. "Samuel Walker. It is a good, strong name." He looked at Ruth, his wife, the mother of his child, the woman who had chosen to stay when every other woman had run away. "Thank you," he said, the words completely inadequate for everything he felt. Ruth shook her head firmly. "Do not thank me for this. We built everything together. All of it. This baby is just the newest part of what we are building. Elena stood in the doorway, watching them with ancient, knowing eyes that had witnessed many families begin over her long years. I have seen many families start, she said quietly. I have seen most of them fail and fall apart. But this one has a real chance to last, because you both truly understand what it costs to build something real. Tom stayed by Ruth's bedside the entire night, watching his exhausted wife sleep with their newborn son cradled safe against her chest. The fire crackled low in the hearth. Snow whispered against the dark windows. The world outside was cold and harsh and completely indifferent to their small human drama. But inside the cabin, everything was warm. Everything was alive. Everything had changed forever. The first year of young Samuel's life passed faster than Tom would have believed possible. Ruth recovered from the birth within weeks, returning to her work around the ranch with the same determined efficiency she had always shown. She fashioned a carrying sling from one of Elena's traditional Apache blankets, wearing Samuel secure against her chest while she worked, so he was always close to her heartbeat. The baby grew strong and healthy under his parents' watchful care. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's sharp, intelligent eyes. He cried when he was hungry and slept soundly when he was full. He seemed to absorb the natural rhythms of ranch life as easily as breathing, unbothered by wind or cold or the constant activity around him. The Sandoval family visited often, their own children fascinated by the new baby. Maria Sandoval, mother of 5 herself, gave Ruth practical advice on everything from feeding schedules to treating teething pain. The two women became genuine friends, bound by shared experience rather than mere proximity. Even Silver Creek's attitude toward the Walker family began to shift noticeably. Mrs. Henderson, who had gleefully gossiped about Tom's failures for years, actually offered congratulations when he came to town for supplies. Her tone still carried an edge of superiority, but the words themselves were surprisingly kind. "A healthy son," she said. "Well done, Mr. Walker. Perhaps you have finally figured out how to keep a wife properly." Tom ignored the implied insult hidden in the compliment and tipped his hat politely. Ruth had taught him that some battles simply were not worth fighting. The ranch itself prospered that year. The cattle herd grew by 30 healthy head. Ruth's chickens produced enough eggs to trade in town for goods they could not make themselves. Her vegetable garden yielded far more than their small family could eat, allowing them to preserve plenty for winter while still sharing generously with neighbors. People throughout the valley began to notice and comment. "Tom Walker's place is doing well these days," they said with varying degrees of surprise. "Must be that wife of his. She actually works like she means it." Samuel's first birthday was celebrated quietly at the ranch. Just the immediate family, the Sandovals, and Elena, who had made the long journey down from her mountain home for the special occasion. Ruth baked a simple cake. Tom carved a small wooden horse for his son to play with. Samuel mostly wanted to chew on everything within reach and crawl determinedly after the family dog. That night, after the guests had departed and Samuel was sleeping peacefully in a small cradle, Tom and Ruth sat together on the porch watching the stars emerge one by one. "One year," Ruth said softly. "It seemed impossible when I first arrived here." "Did it?" Ruth nodded slowly. "I was so certain I would fail somehow, that something about me would not fit properly, that you would eventually send me away like all the others." Tom turned to look at her familiar profile in the starlight. "I was certain you would choose to leave. Every morning for that entire first month, I woke expecting to find you already gone. What finally changed your mind?" Tom thought about the question seriously. "The 7th day, he said finally, when you told me directly that you were not leaving. No one had ever said that before. Not like they truly meant it." Ruth smiled in the darkness. "I almost did not say it. I thought it might sound desperate or foolish. But I needed you to understand. I am glad you did say it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of wind and distant animals and creaking wood. "Tom," Ruth said eventually. "Yes? Do you remember what you told the postmaster that day? About the wolf circling the campfire?" Tom nodded. He remembered every word. "I think about that sometimes," Ruth said thoughtfully, "about how you saw yourself back then. Circling alone in the cold. Afraid to come close, but more afraid of freezing." Tom waited for her to continue. "I was a wolf too," she said. "I just did not realize it until I came here. All those years at the orphanage, I thought I was building a meaningful life. But really I was just circling the edges, waiting for someone to give me permission to come in from the cold. And now Ruth reached over and took his rough hand in hers. Her fingers were calloused from years of honest work, strong and capable. "Now I am finally warm," she said simply. By their second wedding anniversary, Ruth was pregnant again. This time there was no fear or uncertainty. They knew what to expect and how to prepare. They worked together, adjusting routines and planning for the months ahead. Samuel, now a sturdy toddler who ran more than he walked, would have a younger sibling to grow up alongside. The second pregnancy proved harder than the first. Ruth was older now, and years of demanding physical labor had taken their toll on her body. She tired more easily. Some difficult mornings she could barely force herself out of bed. But she never complained, never asked to stop working entirely. She modified what she could manage and gracefully accepted help with tasks beyond her current strength. Elena came to stay for the final month, her ancient hands still sure and steady as she prepared the cabin for another birth. "You are strong," she told Ruth one quiet evening. "But true strength also means knowing when to rest." Ruth nodded thoughtfully. "I am learning that lesson slowly." The second child came easier than the first. A daughter this time, born in early autumn with the leaves just beginning to turn gold and red on the mountains. They named her Clara, after Ruth's own mother who had died when Ruth was young. She was a quiet, thoughtful baby, content to observe the busy world around her with serious dark eyes. Samuel was utterly fascinated by his tiny sister. Years passed like water flowing steadily downhill. Samuel grew tall and strong, learning to ride a horse confidently before he turned 5, helping meaningfully with ranch work before he turned 7. Clara grew quiet and thoughtful, preferring books when they could get them, showing an intelligence that sometimes surprised even her educated mother. The ranch expanded steadily with each passing season. More cattle, more land acquired, a larger house built with help from the Sandovals and other neighbors who had come to genuinely respect the Walker family. Tom Walker was no longer seen as the half-breed nobody wanted. He was recognized throughout the territory as a successful rancher, a good, reliable neighbor, a devoted husband and father. People who had once placed eager bets on his failures now sought his advice on cattle and land management. Ruth was no longer the desperate woman fleeing a predator in Kansas City. She was the respected heart of a thriving household, a valued member of the community, a mother who had raised 2 healthy children in country that had broken countless lesser people. Elena lived long enough to see both grandchildren walk and talk and begin learning the old ways. She died peacefully one winter, surrounded by the family she had finally approved of, having given her blessing to everything Tom and Ruth had built together. Her last words to Ruth were simple and true. "You proved me right. I always knew you belonged here." The children grew into capable young adults. Samuel became a skilled horseman, inheriting his father's quiet strength and his mother's practical intelligence. Clara showed remarkable talent for learning, eventually traveling to Denver to become one of the first female schoolteachers in the territory. Neither child ever forgot where they came from or what their parents had sacrificed to build them a good life. When curious neighbors asked Tom the secret to his long successful marriage, he always gave the same honest answer. "I stopped trying to protect her from the hard life. I started letting her help me build it instead." And when neighbors asked Ruth why she had stayed when so many women before her had run away, her answer was equally simple. "I came here looking for purpose. I found something much better. I found someone worth building a life with." The wind still blew hard across the valley every season. The land remained as unforgiving as it had always been. Winters were still long and brutal. Summers still brought drought and fire and endless work. But the ranch endured through everything. The family grew stronger with each passing year. The legacy they built together continued long after they were gone. And long after the gossip faded from Silver Creek's memory, long after the dust settled on their simple graves on the hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, people still told the story of Tom and Ruth Walker. They told of the man nobody wanted and the woman who saw what everyone else had missed. They told of 3 spectacular failures in one marriage that lasted an entire lifetime. They told of storms survived and children raised in a home built from nothing but determination and partnership and honest hard work. But mostly people said that the strongest thing Ruth Collins ever did was not arriving at Tom Walker's ranch that autumn day so many years ago. It was seeing exactly how hard the life would be, understanding completely what she was choosing, and building it anyway. That was the real story. That was the legacy that mattered. And if you have ever felt like you did not belong anywhere, if you have ever been judged unfairly before you open your mouth, if you have ever wondered whether someone out there might actually choose you despite everything the world says you are not worth, then remember Ruth and Tom Walker. Remember that the strongest roots grow in the hardest ground. Remember that true partnership means building together, not protecting someone from the work. Remember that love is not always thunder and lightning. Sometimes love is simply choosing to stay.